Hi everyone. I want to start today by doing a quick recap of the skills that we've been learning so far um, and use that to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So in the first two skills that we practiced and looked at poems to see that skill being used, those were the physical senses and then the tone and attitude. We were really just looking at description and then word choice within that description. And so we were learning how to describe, essentially, if we want to put it in poetry terms, to use imagery, to use description of concrete things to represent an attitude or a feeling or an idea. And that's what we've been trying so far with those first two. We also revisited that same thing of imagery and description in the metaphor skill practice, because that was basically putting imagery in a new package. If we go back, though, to the imperative skill practice, we were learning how to control our sentences or use different types of sentences. Now, of course, we used the imperative to drive more specific detail, but still, it was a sentence type that did it, and that sentence type also had an effect on the audience. And that's what we're going to revisit today. Different sentence types, different sentence constructions, also known as syntax, that create different effects on the reader. They have different purposes and different effects. We're going to look at a couple sentence variations. Again, some of these you do naturally, and some of them we're just going to give language to so you can practice doing them more or doing them for the first time. And then in your skill practice for for syntax, you're going to be asked to use as many different variations of these syntax constructions as you can to just change the way that your description develops. So I'm going to go to a worksheet first. And it's called Syntax Variations. Again, the goal of today is to organize or construct your sentences on purpose by knowing the purpose and effect of different sentence types. So to do this, we start by just identifying the standard sentence in English: subject, verb, and object. We looked at that when we talked about the freighting, reading from audio Strunk and White. And the sentence that I'll use as an example today, again, I don't know why this came to me, but it did, is we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. I think because savored is something we used when we were talking about freighting. And so we have the basics. We is the subject, savored is the verb, and then our breakfast picnic, specifically our breakfast picnic in the park, becomes the object. So first, we want to look at the use of dependent clauses. We're going to look at something called appositive clauses. We're going to look at the skill that you read about in the Adios, Strunk, and White called telescope, and then the other two skills from Adios, Strunk, and White called very short sentence and splitting the second. But we're going to start first with ones you didn't read about and make sense of them. So, first we have dependent clause. You use this all the time, you've used it before, but let's label it. Basically, a dependent clause lets you introduce time or place or condition before the independent clause. So if I want to put that we savored our breakfast picnic and introduce first the time or place or condition in which it is happening, I would use a dependent clause. So the first example is really easy because I already have this place that I've identified in the standard sentence in the park. So an easy way to think about a dependent clause is just to move this place identifier to the beginning of the sentence and then let the independent clause we savored our breakfast picnic follow. So the dependent clause here is in the park. Dependent clauses will always be followed by a comma, and then after the comma, you begin with the primary subject and verb of the independent clause. But here, very simple, in the park, we savored our breakfast picnic. It's just a different way to say we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. Now, to show you a dependent clause that introduces time, not place, I'll use this example. Before we went our separate ways, we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. Before here setting a time and really a circumstance or a condition in which this main action is happening. Dependent clauses will pretty much all begin with prepositions. Prepositions that indicate place, in, over, behind, below, under, so on and so forth. Or prepositions that indicate time. Before, after, during, meanwhile, then. Then actually doesn't work as a preposition, but anything that indicates time here. So that's your basic dependent clause. We're going to see these in the James Wright poem in just a little bit. Then we have a appositive sentence, and this is adding a modifying description between the subject and verb of the independent clause. So let me go to the second example first. This is our basic sentence. We savored our breakfast picnic in the park. But here I'm going to separate the subject and the verb, we savored, with a modifying description, a description that lets me say something a little bit extra about the we. In this case, I'm describing or defining the we as lingering together a little longer. So we call this a positive phrase because it almost like a parenthesis takes a break to say something more about the we before the sentence continues. So, sentence begins as usual, takes a little bit of a sidetrack, and then gets back to the verb and object. I also did this within a combination example of a positive and dependent clause. So in this example, I have both things going on. In the morning is a dependent clause, and the sentence could say, in the morning, we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. But here I use a positive phrase, before the rain spilled down, to describe the morning or the time a little bit more specifically. It almost looks like a second dependent clause, but it's really defining the morning weather a little bit more detail. So in the morning, before the rain spilled down, we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. So these are positives. You read about the next three. So this is recap. We have telescope, which means to zoom in on a detail or set of details in the independent clause. So we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. That's our main independent clause. Now we could end this sentence with a period, as we already did. But a telescope says, no, I want to zoom in on a detail within that main independent clause further. So instead of a period, we give a comma, and then we zoom in on something. So here I'm zooming in on the action of savoring / the breakfast, the type of breakfast. So I'm zooming in on the yolk from our eggs dipped in toast running down our fingers. Think of it like a telescope on a camera. This first part is kind of like the zoom out. There's a couple in the park, and someone took a picture of them from the parking lot. And you can just kind of see them from a distance. But then if you use the camera to zoom in closely on what they're doing, you start seeing that there's egg yolk dipped in toast and it's on their fingers. And again, it's like a telescope camera. So that's telescope. Very short sentence is to contrast a longer sentence with a short independent clause. So I used a combination of sentences from my positive, dependent clause, and even, those two, to create a long sentence and followed it with a short sentence. In the morning, before the rain spilled down, we, lingering together a little longer, savored our breakfast picnic in the park. A curious gladness shook me. So here I have this long sentence that then is followed with a quick sentence, only 5 words, to capture an idea, an emotion, an additional description. And it calls quite a bit of attention to it. What very short sentence should do is call attention to certain language within the short sentence. So yeah, we could say curious, or we would maybe at first go to gladness. Oh, he's happy. But then we also have this word shook. It adds this element of excitement, of nervousness maybe. And so this word shook gets our attention because it comes in a short sentence. The less words you have in a sentence, the more each of them will be emphasized. This line actually is taken from a Stanley Kunitz poem that we will read later in the quarter. Very short sentence is relative. So if I have a long sentence that's 50 words long, then a short sentence will be 10 words long. If I have a long sentence that's 20 words long, like this one, then a short sentence is more like 5 words. So it's in relation to the sentences around it. Splitting the second. This is to split the action or the verb of the independent clause into multiple, more specific actions or verbs. So before we just had savored our breakfast picnic in the park, but I want to give more detail to it so that we can see how the savoring is happening. So I give a series of actions to slow down what savoring is happening. We dipped toast into our eggs, let the yolk drip down around our fingers, and laughed at the mess of it as we savored our breakfast picnic in the park. So there you go. Here are our 5 variations of syntax, variations from your standard independent clause. And these are all variations that you're going to practice in your next skill exercise for syntax. Describe your topic, describe your action, describe the scene in which that action is taking place, and do it using these sentence constructions. Of course, I haven't noted this yet, but as you build onto new skills, you're of course going to use the ones that you've learned before. So you're still using physical detail, you're still using tone attitude, you're still using metaphor if you'd like, maybe an imperative if you like, but now you're adding to it the skill of syntax. Choosing syntax on purpose. So we didn't fully talk about the effect of these though. Why do these differently? And I'll take a quick note. We're going to dig into this more at a later date. This idea of a dependent clause, yes, it introduces a condition for the independent clause, but also creates a little bit of a suspense, a little bit of a delay. As readers in English, we're always looking for the main subject and verb to create a sense of completeness. The sentence isn't done until the period comes, until the main subject begins acting. So this idea of dependent clauses creates a little bit of a delay, a little bit of a suspense. Now this one's very short, so I don't know how much suspense it creates. But we're going to look at Ernst Stadler's The Saying today and notice that his dependent clauses go on for quite a long time and creates quite a bit of suspense and uncertainty in the reader. And that's a purposeful effect that he wants to have. A positive, this has the effect of just trying to nail down specific detail. It shows that the writer is trying to capture the complete reality of the situation. Telescope, also, intent on catching the reality, not living in generalities, but being in specifics, and those specifics engage the reader, keep them invited into the scene. The closer and closer you get to the details, the more and more that the reader can realistically imagine. Very short sentence, we already said, it creates emphasis. It calls attention to an idea, a word, an emotion, and it's almost like an exclamation mark. It wants us to stop and say, oh, there's something important in that short sentence that I should pay attention to. And then splitting the second, also inviting the reader into the more specific reality of the description, rather than just staying with generalities or abstract descriptions. So we got to apply these now to our poem, to our poems. And we have 2 today. We have Lying on a Hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota, and Ernst Stadler's The Saying. So, I'm going to read this poem, probably read both today, just because um, it's good to hear the sentence moving in different ways. I'm going to read them and just quickly point out some key effects that the syntax is having in this poem, and also on the meaning of this poem. Lying in a hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly, asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distances of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for home. I have wasted my life. Yeah, that last sentence probably jumps out at you the first time you read it, maybe even confuses you. You're not sure what this poem is trying to be about, what its message is. I would make an argument that we could look closely at the syntax of this poem to figure out what it's about. But first, let's just identify these syntax variations. Dependent clauses. We have over my head. We have down the ravine behind the empty house. To my right. And that's it. So we have three sections of this poem, right? There's three different sentences that each go on for 3 lines. So these three, and those 4 that begin with a dependent clause. It's interesting to note how we have 3 different dependent clause sentences that go on for 3 to 4 lines each, contrasted to the end of the poem, where it's 3 sentences back to back to back that are on 1 line and are all independent clauses. None of them begin with a dependent clause. So we're going to talk about the effect of that. So what else do we have? So we have the dependent clause. We talked about positives. This isn't a positive. He's describing the butterfly in a little bit more detail. A little bit closer detail than just saying bronze butterfly. And he's separating it out with commas. It's almost like a little parentheses. Same thing with this second dependent clause looking clause here, but it's in a positive. It's defining what's to my right a little bit more closely, and it's set off between the 2 commas. Those are the 2 of positives. Now we have telescope. Here is our independent clause. I see the bronze butterfly. And what does he do? He zooms in on something the butterfly is doing, and it's blowing like a leaf in green shadow. So that's a telescope there. We also have one more telescope, and that is a chicken hawk floats over, and it is looking for home. The sentence could have ended after chicken hawk floats over, period, but he wants to extend the detail of it, so he gives a comma and zooms in on what it's doing. And then lastly, I don't know how to mark this fully, but this is a very short sentence. Maybe I'll just put parentheses or quotes around it. So now that's our very short sentence. Calls attention to the word wasted. We don't have any split the second in this poem, but we have all other 4 of them, the syntax variation skills. So that's just first identifying that they're there and that each sentence is constructed in a slightly different way. Variation in and of itself is attractive to the reader. If all your sentences were subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object, independent clause after independent clause, your reader's going to get bored. The voice is going to seem robotic and stale. So we look to give variation first and foremost. Now, later on in the quarter, we're going to continue a deeper analysis of this poem by looking at its lineation slash syntax. It's a skill that poets use to make meaning, to say what this poem is about or what its argument is. And for us, that comes down to interpreting what this last line means. What does he mean by wasted? First of all, the short sentence calls our attention to wasted, and it shows that it needs to be interpreted. So how to interpret wasted? This could mean a couple of different things. He could mean that this whole afternoon of laying on a hammock and looking at the scene was a waste of time, and he is condemning himself for wasting his time. It could mean that everything he did before this moment, the rest of his life, whatever happened in his life before this, was a waste, because this is so much what he wants to be doing versus what else he was doing in his life. So those are even two options. There are probably a couple other options of how to interpret wasted, but the basic idea is that there are two possibilities. First, we get our attention called to wasted, then we need to figure out what he means by it. So we would go to the details of the poem to try to support one of the other. Do you get a sense from the description in this poem that he feels that it's a waste? Or do you get a sense from the description of this poem that he's taken great joy in it? We can go back and forth, and I would like to hear your thoughts at some point. We will have optional video conferences as a class to discuss our poems in more detail. That would be a good time to pose your questions and state your observations. But I'm going to say today that most of the description in this poem seems very pleasant. He's enjoying it. He's enjoying it so much that he's describing poop as golden stones, horse poop as golden stones. It seems to be very positive. He seems to be enjoying this and leaning back into his hammock even as darkness comes on, that he's very much relaxed and at peace, which tells me that he has wasted his life before this. That's not the only interpretation, though. This poem actually has been debated for 60 years since its publication. But the point is that the short sentence called our attention to the need to interpret. Now, as we look at lineation and syntax more closely, we're going to talk about how the fact that the poem is divided into these identifiable sections. The last 3 lines are each one independent clause at a time, or one line, and the first 10 lines are dependent clauses and appositive descriptions and telescoping descriptions that they say something about his thoughts about the scene. It's almost like these create a delay where he's just trying to figure out where he is, but then he speaks with a lot of certainty over how he's feeling and what he's seeing. It's very direct, short sentence, one line, which tells me again that he has wasted everything in his life before this moment, not have wasted this moment. So let's look at one more poem. And we'll just talk about it briefly, call some similarities to another poem that we read already. It's called Try to Praise the Mutilated World. This is similar to that one in that it tells us what it's about. We know what the message of this poem is. The message of this poem is given to us in the last line. There's a command. There's an imperative, if you remember that skill practice. Stop being a ghost. Meaning, stop being detached from reality. And this is a message that he wants the audience to feel, to understand, and to believe. And how he gets them to believe it is what we would look to the rest of the poem to support. What evidence What persuasive description, what emotional responses does the audience have that get them to say, yes, I want to stop being a ghost? Part of it is the syntax. Part of it is the fact that the sentence, the independent clause, is at the end of the poem. This is the heart of the sentence that starts at when and ends at stop being a ghost. The independent clause is I freeze where I am. And everything that comes before this is a dependent clause. And dependent clause, some of which is followed up by a positive, some of which is followed up by telescope. So what is the effect of this long delay, this long delay, this long delay before we get I freeze? It's this idea of suspense, tension, nervousness, um, uncertainty as well, that then is answered in the very end of the poem. Now, it's interesting that the writer makes us feel the very same uncertainty that he feels. That's what he's talking about in this poem. When he feels like he's not being himself, when he feels detached from himself, when he feels like he's being a fake, he needs to tell himself stop being a ghost. But then he makes us, through these dependent clauses that delay, 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 delay the main idea, he makes us feel that same detachment, that same anxiousness, that same suspense, so that when the main idea comes at the end, we're relieved and enlightened to get it. So we have, the opening. In an old book, I stumbled across a saying. It was like a stranger punching me in the face. It won't stop gnawing at me. The first one is technically a quick dependent clause and then an independent clause. And then we have an independent clause with a metaphor, which we've seen before, and a second independent clause. But then after that, we have these when phrases. Again, dependent clauses establish time or place or condition. He says when, 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 when. So that's 5. Each of these then has things like telescope. What is he doing walking around at night? He's looking for a beautiful girl. He has an appositive. When I betray myself with an easy explanation, as if what's dark is clear, as if life doesn't have thousands of locked burning gates. This is an appositive to describe this idea in more detail. It's also a metaphor. And then he continues going. So you get the point. Sentence variation, syntax variation, these different parts working together to enhance the effect, the emotional or intellectual effect the poem is trying to have on us. So that's enough for today. Go into your next description and try to vary your syntax as much as possible, and also pay attention to the effect you think it would have on your reader. And I can't wait to read those, and I will see you again in the next video soon.